On a calm Sunday afternoon in March 2004, 15-year-old Kriss Donald was strolling home through the streets of Glasgow, Scotland. He had no enemies, no connections to gangs, and no reason to suspect that this day would mark his last. Within mere hours, this innocent schoolboy would fall victim to one of the most brutal and racially charged murders in Scottish history, a crime so horrendous that it would forever alter the nation's perception of hate crimes. This is the tale of Kriss Donald, a young life taken by senseless violence, and the 5 men whose thirst for revenge drove them to commit an unthinkable act of evil. At 29 years old, Imran Shahid was a walking contradiction. He viewed himself as the toughest man in Glasgow, a bodybuilder who paraded through the city's neighborhoods as though he owned them. He led a Pakistani gang called the Shielders, primarily active in Glasgow. But despite his self-proclaimed bravado, Shahid had a specific pattern. He exclusively chose targets who were smaller, younger, and weaker than himself. He picked victims who couldn't defend themselves, guaranteeing that he would always emerge victorious and never risk tarnishing his carefully crafted reputation. Shahid's criminal history painted a portrait of a violent, unstable individual. He had convictions for physical assault, drug offenses, and driving violations. But these weren't just minor bar brawls or trivial disputes. Shahid's assaults were savage, often leaving his victims badly injured. In one particularly brutal attack, he had beaten someone to the point of causing permanent brain damage. Instead of feeling remorse, Shahid flaunted this like a badge of honor, showcasing his dominance and strength. Just 3 months before the events of March 2004, Shahid had been released from prison after serving a 30-month sentence for a road rage incident where he attempted to run over a 42-year-old woman. The details of that crime revealed much about his character. A grown man willing to wield a vehicle as a weapon against a middle-aged woman. Despite his history of violence and intimidating demeanor, most people in Glasgow didn't fear Shahid. They secretly laughed at him. They ridiculed his bleached blonde hair, his inflated ego, and his desperate need to validate himself. He was, in many respects, a joke, a pathetic bully, pretending to be a kingpin. But what made Shahid truly perilous was his awareness of this derision and his eagerness to go to any lengths to silence his critics. Sunday, March 14th, 2004 commenced like many other nights for Imran Shahid. He was out at a Glasgow nightclub, heavily drinking, using drugs, and indulging in what he relished most: intimidating others. The nightclub was packed, music blasting, drinks flowing, and Shahid was thriving. Then he spotted them, members of the McCullough Street gang. The relationship between Shahid's gang, the Shielders, and the McCullough Street gang was one of bitter rivalry. These weren't organized crime syndicates battling over turf or drug profits. Instead, they were young men divided mainly along racial lines, with tensions that had been simmering throughout the 1990s in certain Glasgow neighborhoods. The Pakistani gangs and British gangs had been in conflict for years, and the animosity was deep-rooted. When the McCullough Street gang members noticed Shahid on the dance floor, they held nothing back. They threw insults his way, taunting him, humiliating him before the entire club. For a man whose very identity relied on being feared and respected, this public disgrace was intolerable. Shahid's face turned red with fury, his fists tightened. But surrounded by onlookers and bouncers, he had little he could do at that moment. According to witnesses, during this confrontation, Shahid was physically assaulted by rival gang members. The specifics may differ, but what matters is this: Shahid left that nightclub consumed by humiliation and rage. His reputation had suffered a significant blow in the most public way imaginable, and in his twisted mindset, there was only one way to remedy it: revenge. As he exited the club, Shahid made a decision that would shatter multiple lives. If he couldn't locate the exact individual who had humiliated him, he would exact vengeance on any young white male he encountered. It didn't matter their identity, whether they were affiliated with any gangs, or if they had any connection to the nightclub incident. Someone had to pay. Shahid was determined to ensure they made their point after leaving the nightclub. Imran Shahid didn't head home to sleep off his anger and inebriation. Instead, he rallied his crew. There were 5 men in total: Shahid himself, his brother Zishan Shahid, known as Crazy, Zahid Mohammed, nicknamed Ziggy, Faisal Mustak, called Ferrari, and Danish Shahid were also with him. Shahid recounted what had occurred at the club. He spoke of the disgrace he felt, the attack, the disrespect, and then he told them how they would respond. They were going to cruise around Glasgow until they located a young white male, and then they would make him pay for what had been done to their leader. The men squeezed into a car and began stalking the streets of Glasgow like wolves on the hunt for their prey. They drove through neighborhood after neighborhood in search of their target. It didn't matter who it was. They simply needed to find someone vulnerable, alone, and easy to dominate. They passed by countless potential victims, but each was turned down for various reasons: too many witnesses, too close to a police station, or too many people around. But Shahid was resolute. He wouldn't go home until he got his revenge. 15-year-old Kriss Donald was a typical Scottish teen. He adored football, loved hanging out with his friends, and had his whole life ahead of him. He lived in the Pollokshields area of Glasgow with his family, who described him as a kind and friendly boy who got along with everyone. On that Sunday afternoon, Kriss was simply walking home with a friend. They had spent the day just like any teenagers would, chatting, laughing, and enjoying the weekend. As they strolled down Kenmore Street, neither had any idea they were being watched. Imran Shahid's car slowly crept up beside them. The windows rolled down. Shahid looked at the 2 boys and saw exactly what he wanted: young, white, and vulnerable. These boys had nothing to do with the nightclub incident. They didn't know Shahid, had never crossed him, and had no ties to any gang. But to Shahid, they represented the individuals who had humiliated him. And that was all it took. Kriss's friend would later describe what happened next with chilling clarity. The men in the car called out to them. Before the boys could fully react, the car doors swung open, and several men leaped out. They reached for both boys. However, Kriss's friend managed to break free and take off running. He sprinted away, his heart racing, and sought help. Kriss Donald wasn't as fortunate. The men overpowered the 15-year-old and pulled him into their car. Kriss fought back with all his might, screaming for help, but he was no match for 5 adult men. They threw him into the vehicle and sped away, leaving behind only Kriss's frightened friend and one of Kriss's shoes that had slipped off during the struggle. The abduction occurred in broad daylight on a public street. Bystanders witnessed it and heard Kriss's screams, but everything unfolded so quickly that by the time anyone could respond, the car had vanished, disappearing into Glasgow's maze of streets with Kriss Donald trapped inside. What transpired with Kriss Donald over the next several hours can only be described as a nightmare. The 15-year-old boy was at the mercy of 5 men filled with rage and hatred, men who viewed him not as a person, but as a representation of their humiliation. The gang drove Kriss around Glasgow for hours. During this time, they subjected him to a terrifying ordeal. They beat him repeatedly. They tormented him and mocked him, detailing what they planned to do to him. And through it all, Kriss pleaded for his life. He begged them to let him go. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, that he didn't even know who they were. His desperate pleas fell on deaf ears. At one point, during the drive, the gang stopped to pick up a 6th member, attempting to expand their group even further. They wanted as many people as possible to take part in their dreadful plans. This was no longer solely about vengeance for Shahid's nightclub humiliation. This had transformed into a twisted bonding experience through violence, a disturbing display of gang loyalty. The men drove Kriss out of Glasgow. As they headed towards Dundee, a city roughly 80 miles away, one of the gang members, Darnish Zahid Ziggy, requested an early drop-off. He later asserted that he wanted nothing to do with the impending events, despite having played an active role in the abduction and doing nothing to assist Kriss during the lengthy hours of his captivity. As they drove through the dark Scottish countryside, Kriss Donald must have sensed his grim fate approaching. The assault had been unyielding, the threats clear, and these men revealed no semblance of compassion or humanity. On a desolate stretch of road near Dundee, the vehicle finally came to a halt. The men forcefully pulled Kriss Donald from the car and dragged him to a secluded area. What unfolded next was so brutal that even seasoned police investigators were taken aback by the gruesome details. The gang members stabbed Kriss Donald 13 times, attacking him with ferocious rage. They repeatedly plunged knives into his body, yet this horrifying assault was not enough for them. As Kriss lay dying from his injuries, they chose to commit an even more abhorrent act. They soaked 15-year-old Kriss Donald in gasoline and set him ablaze while he was still alive. Kriss Donald perished alone, in anguish at the hands of 5 men he had never encountered for a crime he had never committed, merely because of the color of his skin. After murdering Kriss, the gang members returned to their vehicle and drove back to Glasgow as though nothing had transpired. They made no attempt to conceal the body or obscure their trail in any significant way. In their hubris, they seemed to think they could evade the consequences of their actions. The following morning, on March 16, 2004, Kriss Donald's charred. The body was found by a passerby walking along the road near Dundee. The scene was horrific. The remains of a teenage boy, stabbed multiple times and burned beyond recognition. The discovery sent shockwaves throughout Scotland. Police were swiftly notified, leading to an investigation being launched. Within hours, they had identified the victim as Kriss Donald. The 15-year-old boy reported missing after being abducted in broad daylight in Glasgow. Witnesses to the abduction stepped forward, with details about the vehicle and some of the individuals involved. The investigation progressed rapidly. Police located the car used in the crime, and the forensic evidence was irrefutable. They uncovered Kriss's DNA scattered throughout the vehicle. A jacket belonging to one of the suspects contained DNA from Kriss. They also discovered Kriss's other shoe, the one that had fallen off during the initial scuffle. The evidence pointed unambiguously to Imran Shahid and his gang. But when police attempted to apprehend them, they found that 3 of the men, including Shahid himself, had already fled the country. Imran Shahid, his brother Zishan, and Faisal Mustak had escaped to Pakistan. They were aware that at that time, due to the absence of an extradition treaty between Britain and Pakistan, they could evade prosecution by merely remaining there. They believed they had found a refuge where British law could not touch them. However, 2 of the men had not managed to escape. Zahid Muhammad Ziggy and Faisal Mustak Ferrari were quickly tracked down and apprehended. Faisal Mustak, known as Ferrari, became the first individual to face trial for Kriss Donald's murder. His trial commenced in late 2004, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him at the scene of the abduction. Forensic evidence linked him to the crime, and the brutality of what was inflicted upon Kriss Donald shocked the jury. On November 18, 2004, Ferrari was found guilty of murder. He received a life sentence. But more importantly, he became the first person in Scotland to be convicted of a racially motivated murder where the victim was white. This landmark conviction acknowledged what everyone already understood, that Kriss Donald had been targeted, tortured, and killed solely due to his race. Zahid Mohammed Ziggy employed a different tactic. He admitted to participating in Kriss Donald's abduction but claimed he had requested to be dropped off before the murder transpired. He agreed to testify against the other gang members in return for a reduced sentence. Since he technically had not been present at the actual murder and his testimony was considered valuable in prosecuting the others, he received merely 5 years in prison. 5 years for aiding in the abduction of a 15-year-old boy, fully aware that the gang leader intended to kill him. Just 5 years. For taking part in the hours of nightmare that Kriss endured, Ziggy ended up serving just 2.5 years before he was released. This light sentence infuriated many who had been following the case. Although the legal system may have required his testimony, the truth was that without Ziggy's involvement in the kidnapping, Kriss Donald might have managed to escape. He was an active participant in a crime that led to murder, and numerous individuals believed that 2.5 years was a slap in the face to Kriss's legacy. While 2 of Kriss Donald's murderers were incarcerated, 3 others roamed freely in Pakistan. convinced they had eluded justice. For Kriss's family, this was an agonizing predicament. Their son had been ruthlessly killed, and half of his murderers were out of reach of British law. Yet they hadn't anticipated the resolve of a Scottish Member of Parliament named Mohammed Sarwar. Serving as the MP for Glasgow Central, Sarwar dedicated himself to bringing these men back to face the consequences of their actions. He empathized with Kriss's family and was outraged that the killers believed they could simply escape to Pakistan and live ordinary lives. Sarwar repeatedly reached out to the Pakistani authorities. He meticulously detailed the atrocities these men committed against Kriss Donald. He narrated the kidnapping, the torture, the stabbing, and the burning alive of a 15-year-old boy. He urged them to tap into their sense of justice and humanity. After extensive discussions and diplomatic pressure, the Pakistani authorities agreed to take action. Despite the absence of an extradition treaty, they would apprehend the three men and return them to Britain to stand trial. In July of 2005, more than a year after Kriss's tragic death, Imran Shahid, Zishan Shahid, and the other conspirator were detained in Pakistan and extradited back to the United Kingdom. For Kriss's family, it was a moment of relief mixed with sorrow. They would finally see their day in court, but it still wouldn't restore Kriss. The trial of Imran Shahid, Zishan Shahid, and their accomplice commenced in October of 2006, 2.5 years after Kriss Donald's murder. All three men entered not guilty pleas, despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against them. The trial dragged on for several weeks. The jury listened to testimonies from witnesses who had witnessed the abduction. They heard from forensic specialists who clarified the DNA evidence. They were informed of the horrifying experiences Kriss Donald suffered during his final moments, and they heard from Kriss's family about the young boy who had been taken from them. On November 6, 2006, after deliberating for 8.5 hours, the jury delivered their verdict. All three men were convicted of Kriss Donald's murder. The decision was unanimous. Each man received a life sentence. Yet, even in the face of justice, none of them expressed any remorse. They offered no apologies to Kriss's family. They didn't acknowledge the suffering they had inflicted. They merely accepted their sentences in silence, as cold and unfeeling as they had been on that dreadful night in March of 2004. Life in prison did not treat Kriss Donald's murderers kindly. The heinous nature of their crime, the brutal slaying of a 15-year-old boy, made them targets among other inmates who adhered to their own codes of justice. Zishan Shahid, Imran's brother, had to be transferred between prisons multiple times due to continued targeted violence from other inmates. Despite the prison system's best efforts to shield him, he remained in constant danger from prisoners seeking revenge for Kriss Donald. Faisal Mustak received an additional 6 years added to his sentence in 2015 for perjury and obstructing justice. Even from behind bars, he continued to display the same contempt for the law and truth that had initially led him into the world of murder. Zahid Mohammed, who had served only 2.5 years for his involvement in Kriss's abduction, was released and immediately changed his name to Yusuf Harib, trying to distance himself from the crime. But in 2017, he found himself back in prison after making threats to kill someone. His claims that he never intended to harm Kriss Donald seemed empty when he was caught issuing death threats, just a few years after his release. But perhaps the most revealing story is that of Imran Baldi Shahid, the mastermind behind it all. The tough guy who had once ruled the streets of Glasgow quickly realized he was no longer a big player in prison, surrounded by men who were genuinely dangerous and who loathed child murderers. Shahid's reputation meant nothing. In 2013, while exercising in the prison gym, Shahid was assaulted by fellow inmates. They grabbed metal bars from the weightlifting equipment and used them as weapons, smashing 33-pound dumbbells against his head. The attack crushed his cheekbones, shattered his jaw, and ruined his teeth. The tough guy, who had only ever bullied those weaker than him, finally faced someone who could fight back. Then, in 2022, Shahid tried to take his own life by cutting his throat. He survived, but prison staff later confessed they didn't care much about saving him. Shahid asserted he had attempted suicide to shield his family from becoming targets, but scarcely anyone believed this rationale, especially from a man who had shown no ability for selfless thought. Kriss Donald was 15 years old at the time of his death. He should have had his whole life before him. He should have graduated high school, maybe gone to college, discovered love, launched a career, and perhaps started a family of his own. He should have witnessed his friends grow up, his parents age, and his hometown transform and develop. Instead, his life came to a tragic end on a dark road in Scotland, at the hands of 5 men who had no prior knowledge of him, had never met him before that day, and killed him simply because of the color of his skin. The murder of Kriss Donald compelled Scotland to confront uncomfortable realities about racism, gang violence, and hate crimes. It highlighted that racial violence wasn't merely an issue affecting minority communities. It could impact anyone, anywhere. It resulted in revisions on how hate crimes were prosecuted and understood within Scottish law. But more than a legal case or a statistic, Kriss Donald was a tangible person. He was someone's son, someone's friend, someone's peer. His family still mourns him. His community still honors his memory. And his name should not be remembered solely as a victim, but as a young man whose life held significance, whose death was a heartbreaking loss, and whose legacy insists that we stay alert against hatred in all its forms. The 5 individuals who took Kriss Donald's life are serving life sentences. They will likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars. But justice, though essential, doesn't erase the suffering. It won't bring Kriss back. It doesn't reverse the terrors of his last moments, or give his family another day to spend with their son. All we can do is remember Kriss Donald, cherish his memory, and dedicate ourselves to creating a world where such meaningless hatred is non-existent, where young people can walk home in safety, where the color of someone's skin doesn't make them a target, where 15-year-olds get to grow up and enjoy the lives they deserve. Rest in peace, Kriss Donald. Your life was significant, your story matters, and you will not be forgotten.